All right, everyone, it's time for a subject I've touched on briefly, but I've never actually, I think, made a video about it in full. The Occult video 203, Occult Gardening. That is the general sense of things related to the occult. Link in the description to actually a very good book that I've edited called The Witch's Pharmacopoeia. It's quite a wonderful work. It's one of the reviews on there, which was middling in popularity. They're like, well, it's some Shakespearean quotes and sort of a list of factoids. Yes, that is what it is, and it's highly interesting. You probably wouldn't know anything about these otherwise. Sort of details some of the plants that are used within a magical setting, both in fiction and in more factual works. I find that fascinating myself. I know it's an acquired taste for some. Plants have a long history intertwined with the occult, talking about shamanism. In the most primitive sense, it is highly likely that psychedelics definitely played a role in the development of early human spirituality. We're talking about literally the stoned ape theory. When we're talking about Terence McKenna sort of theory. I happen to largely agree with it. I think it goes further. But it definitely played a role. Like, there's no question, I think, at this point. Yes, indeed, primitive people, whenever hungry, would go out and pretty much eat whatever they could. And if they hadn't experimented with the plant yet, they probably did. They almost certainly encountered amanitas, especially in the zone where early, Homo sapiens developed. Even Neanderthals and so forth. We're talking about probably the prevalence of amanitas. Psilocybin mushrooms were almost certainly consumed. Marijuana was consumed very early on in the human timeline. We know that up to several tens of thousands of years ago, people who were essentially non-linguistic at the time, for the most part, that probably had a mostly gestural language and wandered around, they were already brewing beer after a fact. They had stone vessels that function as like little systems where you can put, I guess, the fruit and grains and shit, mash it up in there, and you'll get alcohol out of it. It's literally a crude fermentation process. I think that requires significantly more understanding than understanding, hey, if I eat this mushroom, I see cool shit. If this plant is lit on fire, I left it by the fire and we all got high and stuff. They understood cause and effect enough to understand the primitive basis of the brewing process. They would have understood these other things. As soon as man was able to work with fire, make tools that required more than just basic sharpening, a skin hot on a wooden scaffold, they would have been using all sorts of drugs. This informs human spirituality. Within the context of gardening, though, we have to wait until we've got at least horticulturalism, at least the basic premise of having a sort of area where you've planted things deliberately. In some cases, I believe this is the case with the Yanomami. They sort of wander around and plant these little gardens, and they have sort of a circuit that they go around on. That is, they migrate within a given region that they inhabit to some extent. They've got basically what would be stations along this sort of circular. I think it's the Yanomami I'm thinking of, and they would have these little, gardens. They do a lot of psychedelics. I believe DMT-containing plants are used by them as well. I wonder if salvia would be available to them. I'm not exactly sure. I know that tends to be Central America more. You're talking about a little further north than truly South America. But they have access to various things. The Maasai people, another, if you've studied anthropology at all, even, probably to some extent within high school, you've probably heard of the Maasai tribes. Their warriors will literally go out in part of their life and become like basically exile migrants, and they'll use all sorts of drugs during this period. I believe they're traditionally high as balls when they come back to the tribe upon reaching the status of elder, like they're going to become elders instead of just warriors, and so they come back. Their wildness is over. Their wild days of basically being transient end. They come back roaring high and be scary, and I guess it's sort of a rite of severance. I'm getting a little off topic. In the modern sense, though, the occult garden can be thought of as a place that serves two purposes. One is very utilitarian. What plants are you growing for what purposes? You use them in a spell, you use it in some poultice or something. Like I grow catnip. It's got a fairly obvious effect, not really for human use, although you can turn it into a tea. By the way, many people don't understand this. Catnip in a tea is quite tasty. It's mildly sedating. It's almost a little bit like chamomile, much like cats. By the way, as an aside, if you eat it, like when cats eat it, it's a mild sedative. If you, however, smoke it, you'd have to smoke. Cats can just smell it, but for us, we'd have to smoke it. It actually is a short-lived mild stimulant. Yeah, I've tried it myself. That was very funny at the time. People thought it was hilarious to smoke catnip. It actually does have some sort of psychotropic effect. I'm not sure exactly how to quantify it. It's just sort of a clarity. It's almost felt a little bit like maybe a higher amount of yerba mate or something, which you could grow if you're in a tropical climate. So one is strictly utilitarian. The other is purely aesthetic. What do you think of when you think of a cult? If you're following some older pagan path, like if you follow Zoroastrianism, and the Zoroastrians are very much into sort of that pan-Persian tradition, actually, of the formal garden being associated with wisdom, being associated with power in many cases, because you're living in a desert, you have the ability to grow this lush, beautiful garden, even for just aesthetics' sake. Yeah, you're probably fairly wealthy. You have an extra share of the water from the local aqueduct, so to speak. What happens is the garden also takes on a very symbolic aesthetic role. And it can be just for relaxation, basic pleasure. The healing power of relaxation, I think, is key there. Or it can be a little bit beyond there, like if you believe in feng shui or something like that. I tailor my garden to be attractive and utilitarian at the same time. And the occult garden, with your henbane or your witch hazel or whatever, can coexist with, again, a very utilitarian vegetable garden. In my garden, I've got the kitchen herbs in one spot. There's flowers all over. They scatter them around a bit for the pollinators mostly. It's good if you plant things in a cottage garden arrangement. It will tend to resist pests more, because if you have 3 or 4 plants in proximity instead of just growing one species per bed, those plants can aid one another. They can do that with regards to soil structure and microbes, nutrient uptake, for instance, a grain with a legume, a good companion planting. They can have other actions too, like chamomile. Plant it near any other plant, it doesn't care. It'll grow bigger because of it. The chamomile helps them resist disease and pests. It actually helps with soil fungus resistance or something like that. It's antimicrobial. It attracts pollinators. It's also good in tea. I've still got a whole container of it over here. But the occult garden, the occult goes beyond the utilitarian, like, hey, I'm making my witch's poison brew here, putting it in a cool skull-shaped bottle, and then, basically I bottle it, maybe I sell it, maybe, on Etsy or something at that point. It goes beyond that. Because even diet is treated upon with the occult. There's a book on nutrition by Rudolf Steiner. I can't remember the exact title. It's been treated on, I can't remember exactly the name of the book. There was a fairly famous, fairly short text that was released, I believe, in the 1200s, the 13th century, if I remember correctly. And it proposed to be a guide to Alexander the Great, written by his mentor, on what he should do to govern his life, and a lot of it is dietary in nature. There have been medieval sort of books that talk about, the old trope about turnips, for example, being something they ate back in the Middle Ages. That's based on basically occult lore from the time. It stressed that turnips were good for you, not just as a standard root crop that's easy to grow and mildly nutritious. I believe they listed it as a diuretic and as something that could help with catarrh, I think, or something, in some of these works. And so you should definitely read some of these herbals. They're quite interesting. But it goes beyond that. It's also aesthetic. It's very historical, and it changes from culture to culture. What you identify with a witchy garden in the sense of American witchcraft is going to be different from what you would see in the Hindu tradition. And there are actually long passages in some of their sacred works about certain spiritual benefits to planting certain things. Like some tree that's been dedicated to a god, you're doing it ritualistically, the god's very pleased. I would say planting any tree at this point, unless it's an invasive species, quite important for this world. Everyone should plant a tree as often as possible. And you should definitely, if you have the chance, dig in a garden. It could be indoors too. You'd have a couple of boxes and a grow lamp. So be it, You still have a few plants. Most everyone has some house plants. I've got 30 of them now or something just in this office. I like to be surrounded by nature, and in this climate, I can't garden outside for 8 months out of the year. It's quite sucky. That's about all. Peace out.